This is part 2 in a 4-part webinar series about using source information in your writing. So this video is going to focus on different kinds of evidence that you might include to support the claims that you're making in your research-based argumentative academic writing. So here we go. The first thing I'll say about this topic of using evidence is that anytime you're writing a persuasive paper, you should definitely try to include sufficient evidence to support the claims that you're making. So it's not enough to just say, this is how it is, or this is what I believe, or whatever it is that you want to argue. You have to also back that up with some kind of support, evidence. And so evidence can look like a lot of different things. It's not always just pulling a quote from an article that you found on that topic and plugging that in, although that's a really common way of incorporating evidence in your academic writing. But there's all different kinds. So you have to think about, too, what kind of evidence is going to be effective for the arguments that you're making and the audience that you're speaking to. So do keep your audience in mind. When we're doing academic writing, a lot of time we imagine this sort of invisible audience, or maybe we don't imagine an audience at all, or we imagine that our only audience is the professor who's going to read and grade our paper that we're turning in. But I would advise you to think a little bit deeper about your audience. Who is it that cares about your topic? What do they already know about it? And what can you say to them that they'll find persuasive? So that might mean using one kind of evidence in one writing context versus a different kind of evidence in a different context. And maybe that varies from discipline to discipline, for example, from a history course to a science course, and so on. So think about what kinds of evidence are going to be more or less effective considering who your audience is for this specific writing project that you're working on. You can ask yourself these questions. Who are you writing to or for? What do they already know and believe about this topic? And what are they going to expect from you? Are there common conventions in this discipline or related to this topic that you're discussing or this genre that you're writing in? You have to know what are the expectations so you can meet those expectations, and your audience will find your what you have to say more convincing. So the first broad category of evidence that I'll talk about are primary sources. So you may already be familiar with what primary sources are. I'll give a quick overview just in case. Primary sources are data and texts that are still in need of the researcher's analysis. So let me give you an example to try to make this a little bit more clear. If a person's conducting research on the topic of the use of social media in politics, and they would find, let's say, for example, President Trump's Twitter feed, and all of those tweets, that's primary. That's a primary source. That's a textual artifact, Twitter feed. It's digital that they could go to, look at, and analyze. Nothing's been done to it. It's straight from the president's fingertips. So that is right for their analysis and their interpretation and what they want to say about it. On the other hand, we're talking now a comparison between primary sources and secondary sources. If you found a news article about Trump's use of Twitter, that would then be a secondary source because it's someone else talking about Trump's tweets and how he uses them and their interpretation and commentary and so on and so forth. So if it's directly from the source, if it's raw data, that is a primary source. You have to do something with it, make meaning from it, do some interpretation, do some analysis. Or on the other hand, if it's something someone else has said about the topic you're researching, that would then be a secondary source. So here are a few more examples of some common primary sources that you might find or use as evidence to support an argument. The first one listed is the results of a lab experiment. So this would be used probably in the more hard sciences disciplines. Then there's also data sets. Maybe you would use that in economics, for example, maybe social sciences. Then there's archival materials. So this could perhaps be used for some history research writing, where you go back to original documents in history. You could even use archival materials in more contemporary kinds of research, not necessarily historical. Like, for example, if you wanted to look at a bunch of marketing artifacts to figure out, answer some research question that had to do with marketing and advertisement. Also, images and recordings, so photographs, paintings, maybe videos, speeches that are recorded, things like that. Then you have surveys, observations, and interviews, and any associated documentation to go along with that. The survey data, the survey responses, observational forms or notes that were made, or video recordings, interview transcripts, anything like that. Those are primary sources that you would then analyze, interpret, and write about, and use to help you explain some idea in your research writing. So in comparison to your primary sources, we then have secondary sources, which I've touched briefly on, and I'll explain in a little bit more detail. Secondary sources are things that have been spoken or written about your research topic. So they're going to involve another person's insight and or analysis. So here's a list of some examples of kinds of secondary sources that you would use or encounter. The first one is dictionary or encyclopedic entries, Wikipedia entries. That would be a secondary source. News or magazine articles, also scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles, that would be included there too. Informational websites where you go and get information about a topic, maybe a .gov website, depends on what your research topic is here. Documentary films, that could be another example of a secondary source. I already mentioned scholarly articles, and of course you have books, textbooks, ebooks, anything like that that gives you more information about your topic without being a direct source from the topic itself. So we talked about primary sources and we talked about secondary sources. Here are some other common types of evidence that you might use when you're trying to support the claims that you're making in your writing. So you could use personal experience. In some cases, that is totally legitimate and could help you make your case very well. It might be more welcomed in humanities disciplines. And then, of course, there's historical examples. So maybe you want to make an analogy, a comparison of what you're talking about now to something that happened in the past. There's also hypothetical scenarios. If this happened, then this might happen. We could reason logically. This would be the outcome, like that. And that connects to the next one in this list too, which is logical reasoning. So just walking someone through how you're coming to that conclusion, what are the steps behind it, and your thought process there. And if it makes good sense, then that could be a really effective way to make your point. Of course, you might also want to consider incorporating a counter argument with a rebuttal. So you've made your point, you have a lot of evidence to back it up, but what contradictory evidence could someone else bring to the table? And why don't you bring it to the table first so that you can then discuss that and explain why it's not really something that will ultimately detract from the argument that you want to make? How can you reason through it and explain that you've considered it, but it's not actually a problem, and here's why? So we've talked about primary sources and we've talked about secondary sources, and we've also talked about other kinds of evidence that's used commonly. I will also make one last suggestion to you about using evidence to support your claims, and that is just to think about how you might be varied in the kinds of evidence you incorporate. It can strengthen your case if you have multiple perspectives, multiple points, multiple sources that all confirm the same conclusion that you're getting to in the argument that you have in your paper. So, for example, if you're doing a study that includes primary research, you might have scholarly articles as well as an observation and an interview with a participant. And each of those different points of evidence would all contribute to supporting the argument that you make in that piece of research writing. So in that instance, you would have triangulated your data, which means you have multiple points that all go to supporting your argument. So that might not be, you might not every paper you write is going to be so thorough, is what I'm trying to say. But this strategy of triangulating the data does contribute to the validity of your research methods and your analysis and your argument, and it can help you make the case that the interpretation that you have made of your data is a valid one. Maybe this is more appropriate for graduate student writers and undergraduate writers, but that process of thinking through what different kinds of evidence you could use, that's still beneficial to all writers, I think. If you're not going for triangulation per se, I would encourage you to still be looking for any flaws that you think are apparent in your argument. So take a critical eye to what it is you're arguing and how you're developing your argument, and think about what issues would your potential audience have with that line of reasoning, and try to be proactive in how you address those concerns. And I'll end this webinar video with a little fun practice activity for you. So the question I'm posing is, what kinds of evidence would you probably rely on when you're making a case for or against the ever so trendy keto diet to the following audiences? So if you want to convince your friend to start or stop the keto diet, or talk to your parent about it, or a supervisor at work where you don't want to offend them for sure, or your dietetics professor who certainly would know a lot about this topic already. So what are the different levels of evidence or different types of evidence that you would need to make a solid argument for any of these audiences? I hope this is kind of fun for you to think through, and also to emphasize to you the importance of audience consideration when you're selecting evidence for any kind of research-based argument that you have to write. And the last thing that I'll say again is that the Writing Center is here for you as you work with evidence when you're writing your papers. Here is information about how to make an appointment, and we do have online sessions available. Go to MyLMU, sign in, click Academics, and click the Writing and Course Tutoring link. So we look forward to meeting with you, our writing tutors do, and discussing your writing.